Good morning or good afternoon, folks, depending on where you are with us, joining us today. Thank you for joining us. I'm BK, Director of the Park Maintenance Institute, and we're having another hot streak, at least here in Pennsylvania this week. And so this is a very timely topic. It would be nice to be out there getting wet. But today we have brought along one of our colleagues and sponsors from Vortex Aquatic Structures. So we're going to be talking with Mike McGilbra today. So there's no denying the popularity of splash pads in large and small communities across the nation. Beneath the eye-catching features of these attractions are intricate systems and controls that require well-thought-out maintenance programs. We have invited Mike McGilbra, sales executive and at Vortex Aquatic Structures International, to share his industry knowledge and expertise in aquatic systems through a series of discussions. So for starting off today as an introductory session, we've asked Mike to highlight maintenance priorities, short-term and long-term upkeep for splash pads, and outline essential elements that impact successful splash pad projects. So many of you may already have splash pads, or you may be considering new splash pad projects in your communities. So our learning objectives for today are to explore the difference in maintenance requirements between water management systems and how this can impact design. We're going to consider design strategies used to mitigate common maintenance challenges. And hopefully we're going to gain a better understanding of splash pad systems, the maintenance involved, and their life cycles, because not everything lasts forever. But before we get too far into our presentation, I would like to share a video that has been provided us from our sponsor, Vortex, for this event. I am going to hand everything off now to Mike, and we are in his good hands.
Thanks, BK. All right, guys, thanks so much for your time with me this afternoon. We greatly appreciate it. BK, thank you again. Emily, thank you for helping facilitate this presentation today and this partnership. On behalf of Vortex, we're super excited about this partnership with the Parks Maintenance Institute. There's a lot to learn when it comes to splash pads. In the grand scheme of things, they are still relatively new. And so there's a lot to learn when it comes to the overall maintenance and what's to be expected day in, day out, and throughout the lifespan. So beneath any Vortex splash pad is an intricate system that controls water usage, water quality, and ensures that your attraction is safe, efficient, and sustainable over time. In essence, what we're going to be accomplishing today is breaking down a well thought out maintenance program and schedule that will ensure your users are safe and your splash pad investment is a well-oiled machine. A little bit about me. I joined Vortex in 2015, so I am working on year 6 now. I cover Ohio and Western Pennsylvania. I'll make myself a little vulnerable here. I am in sales. So although we're talking about maintenance today, I am not day-to-day hands-on with everything. However, we will have the privilege of having one of our most experienced service technicians on this call, and he will be able to assist in answering those deep dive questions at the end. Moving forward, I work closely with landscape architects, aquatic designers, and park and recreation officials and decision makers. I help develop play solutions for a wide range of budgetary and programming goals. And I'm strongly focused in inclusivity, sustainability, and optimizing the best water management solution for your project. Okay, so what we're going to be going over today, guys, selecting a water management system and the impact on the design and maintenance. We'll then touch on recognizing the purpose of regular maintenance. You're often going to hear me use the analogy of a car, and why taking care of your car is so important, and using that to connect to a splash pad. So get ready for that. We'll then move and transition into designing a splash pad with safety and maintenance in mind. We'll go over some qualifications for your staff that's going to be taking care of your splash pad on a day in, day out basis. And we'll also be going over a basic maintenance schedule and touching on some tricks of the trade to help you stay ahead of the 8-ball. So this quote here really, it drives home the impact of splash pads that they're having on communities. So splash pad areas continue to hold on to the #1 spot on the list of most commonly planned features in park facilities. Essentially, if you haven't been to a splash pad yet, or you haven't come across a splash pad, if one isn't in your community, chances are in the next year or so, you're going to. Over the last decade, splash pads have emerged as the leader in aquatic play solutions. The designs have the power to draw in a new generation of parents while also accounting for many of the sustainability concerns making today's headlines. Now, this statement might seem like an obvious one. One of the keys to successfully maintaining a splash pad, design and install it with maintenance in mind. But the reality is that that's not always the case. And this leads to problems on site with maintenance crews, as the reality of what's involved in a day in to day out basis starts to sink in. And being on the sales side of things like I am, I can attest to that, because I am in those discovery conversations, and I know that a lot of those conversations are focused on fun and how this is going to look and how kids are going to play with it, and the aesthetics of the entire project. And maintenance sort of has tends to be put on the back burner. So to avoid these problems, it's important to look at what we can do to design a splash pad with maintenance in mind, knowing why maintenance is so important for user safety, and really looking at what is required in terms of maintenance, both on a day in, day out basis and long term. That understanding creates a great knowledge base that will enable you to design a splash pad that requires less maintenance and improves customer satisfaction. All right, so our first section of today's presentation, we're going to be touching on water management and the impact on design and maintenance. So some types of water management. We have flow through and recirculation systems. Okay, so although there are a handful of options when it comes to recirculation, or when it comes to water management solutions, these are the two most popular, especially in our neck of the woods. So we're going to explore these in a little bit more detail. Your flow through solution is as simple as it comes. Okay, so we have a city water line or a potable water source that we are bringing to a manifold. We're bringing to our manifold location, and we'll make a final connection from there. And that's going to be on your screen here, our blue line. The command center then orchestrates the play products based on a preset sequence of timings. Water then passes through our supply lines and out to the features. Water will then make its way to our drain, which is typically going to be hooked up to sanitary sewer. Now I've seen multiple different ways as far as drainage is concerned, but typically in a flow through solution, we're going to be sending our water to sanitary sewer, and typically that's going to be a 6-inch sanitary sewer line. I've been a part of projects that have been allowed to hook up to storm sewer. Typically that does need to be requested through a local health department or the EPA. And I've also been a part of projects where cities have sent that gray water through some foliage and into a retention pond or fishing pond, all of which have passed with flying colors as far as health codes and conduct is concerned. But again, this is that drain line is typically going to be sending that water to sanitary sewer. The other popular type of water management system is a recirculation system. This is often referred to as a water quality management system, or for short, a WQMS. And it works similar to that of a flow-through system with a couple of key differences. Instead of potable water flowing directly to the manifold, what we have here is a closed circuit system using pumps, filters, and chemicals that recycle, filter, and sanitize the water. Very similar to that of your pool systems if you are more familiar with those, except it's all scaled down at a much smaller equipment. So we're looking at a 2,000 and 3,000 gallon tank rather than a 20,000 gallon tank. City water is only added as needed to replenish that aforementioned holding tank when it's lost through evaporation or just your basic carry off from when kids or users leave the splash pad. So different from a flow-through system where a flow-through system doesn't really require all that much maintenance because we don't have pumps, filters, all the equipment that's required for a recirculation system. There is going to be more maintenance, and there's going to be more of this day-to-day type of responsibility when it comes to taking care of your splash pad. The big advantage, however, is that these systems are constantly reusing the same body of water. So if you're paying for water and you want to bring in this wow factor splash pad that's super impressive and is using a lot of thrilling pieces, that's when we start to shift our thought to, okay, it may not be a good idea to just be sending all of this water down the drain, especially if we're looking at paying $15,000, $20,000 a year. We should really start to consider whether this would be a good idea to recycle this water and have it run on a recirculation system. So here's just a good side-by-side. And honestly, folks, if you were to take a screenshot of this right now, I totally recommend it because it's a question that I get all the time, especially in these discovery stages where you might be considering installing a splash pad in your community. I need a pros and cons list of flow through versus recirculation system, and that's what we're showing you right here. So again, flow through uses potable water. It's less electricity consumption, low on maintenance, and really low on parts and pieces throughout the course of time. Again, all we're doing is just hooking up a water line to our manifold, which is then supplying our splash pad. It's ideal for smaller splash pads with low consumption. So oftentimes, if your splash pad is less than 1,500 square feet, and we're using somewhere in the ballpark of 75 gallons per minute or less, typically that's where I start to see flow-through solutions be the most popular. And really it changes from year to year. Another common question I get is, well, what are other folks doing? Are people using flow-through solutions or are they using recirculation solutions? Year in, year out, I sometimes have more recirculation solutions. Other years I have more flow-through solutions. It really all depends on what you're trying to accomplish and understanding all of the analytics and data behind what's going on in your community before we make that decision. So a recirculation system uses much, much less potable water. Again, that water is only turning on when your tank level gets too low. Works very similar. It works exactly like how your toilet works. So that water level gets too low, the makeup water turns on, your toilet fills up, the tank fills up. Okay. A little bit more maintenance involved with the recirculation system and higher upfront cost. But again, it's ideal for bigger splash pads with higher water consumption. Okay, so let's recognize the purpose of regular maintenance and why it's so important. Again, if you're routinely changing your car's oil, checking the tire pressure, here comes that car analogy, doing the annual tune-ups, et cetera, you're not going to be left on the side of the road calling a tow truck. You're not going to be at your car mechanic with an expensive bill in front of you. It's going to expand the lifespan of your car, just as this is going to expand the lifespan of your splash pad. So while keeping kids safe and keeping kids healthy may look like the exact same thing or sound like the exact same thing, there are differences. So when we think about keeping kids safe, we're talking about reducing bumps or bruises or finger entrapments, things of that nature. But when we're thinking about keeping kids healthy, we're talking about illness and eliminating waterborne pathogens. So back to why maintenance is so important when it comes to splash pads. We obviously want to be keeping the equipment running well. This is a large investment for your community, for your facility. If folks are joining us from the commercial side of things, regardless, it's a very large investment. So keeping your equipment on the up and up, looking good, running well, your rotational features are moving smoothly, freely. That's obviously super important. But even more important is to keep the end user safe by making sure that, again, there are no sharp edges. We're preventing those finger entrapments, especially if a nozzle is missing. We're noticing those things right away because we want to be going to that splash pad first thing in the morning and making sure that there isn't a nozzle missing, so those type of circumstances don't rear their head. We also want to be making sure that spots where water never dries, which shouldn't be the case if your splash pad is poured correctly. But in the case that it does happen, I have seen that happen where there are a few puddling spots, that those aren't causing algae, which can possibly lead to slips and falls. COVID-19, it unfortunately is still with us. It still beats us over the head every single day with information and what we should and shouldn't be doing. So it is important to touch on how it's impacting our splash pads. And so according to the CDC, the chlorine levels in your city water are enough to inactivate the virus. So there's little to no concern with water quality in COVID-19 on a flow-through system. When it comes to a recirculation system, same type of deal, but maintaining those sufficient chlorine levels is critical, and adding UV to your solution, and that's required in Pennsylvania. So the folks that are with us from PA, UV is required. So you really don't have to concern yourself with that, but adding UV to your solution, the water becomes even more effective at inactivating the virus. Okay, so hopping back into our maintenance portion of the presentation. When it comes to keeping users healthy, we're essentially making sure our water quality is safe to play in. WQMS systems, water quality management systems, are designed to automatically sample water continuously and then adjust the chemical balance by adding chlorine or bromine or muriatic acid, or sometimes CO2. And in a little further down in this presentation, we'll touch on whatever you're comfortable with from a chemical standpoint, how our systems can adjust to those comfort levels. So a common misconception is that UV and chlorine are doing the same thing, and it's just two separate lines or two different lines of defense. But the reality is that the UV system is sterilizing any pathogens in the water, preventing them from reproducing. And that's so the chlorine can then do its job of eliminating those pathogens. So that minor difference there, but important to understand. So depending on the chemical makeup of your fill water, other pool chemicals may be healthy. So, helpful. So if, say, you're filling your holding tank up with well water and it's it's hard. There's hard iron content. Other chemicals may be helpful in balancing your water quality appropriately. So having chemicals to reduce chlorine or increase pH on hand can also be very effective. It can be an effective way to get the chemicals quickly balanced, or when there's too much of a certain chemical fed into a system. So we always recommend to just keep extra chemicals on hand in a safe, stored place, typically separate from the rest of the water management equipment. So extending the life of your components. In most cases, rotational bushing should be greased annually to extend the life of components with movements such as a cannon head. Our cannons at Vortex, they spin 360 degrees, but they turn off once they get to about 120 degrees. Those turn off automatically so that you can't turn them and shoot somebody who's laying in a lounge chair. So bearings for something like a splash, like a super splash. When I say super splash, I'm talking about a large dumping bucket. Those should be greased twice a year with marine grade grease. In the case of a super wave, again, a large dumping bucket, there will be a Zerk fitting that allows a grease gun to be used to add grease. Items like chemical probes, these should be cleaned with soapy water and a toothbrush 2 to 4 weeks out of a month. Or as needed to both extend the life of the probes as well as to ensure accurate readings. And one big helpful tip, store these in water during the off season. When they're not stored in water during the off season, they often go bad, and then you often have to replace them, and you don't realize these things until 2 or 3 days before you want to open them the next season. And you're like, oh my gosh, Vortex, somebody help me. I need my chemical probes. We're supposed to open in 2 to 3 days. You're storing those in water in your off season. I promise you that you will not be making that call. The time between backwashes is 99% site driven. It's another common question we get, another common question that I get. How often am I going to be backwashing this splash pad? It really is 99% driven. It's bather load and organic material driven. If it's the blazes like it is outside right now, I'm in Cleveland currently, 90 degrees and sunny right now. It's extremely humid. More than likely, there's a lot of splash pads around my area that are filled with kids right now because it's so hot. And and in cases where there is a lot of trees or leaves that tend to find its way to the splash pad, those are also often going to be impact how often you're doing your backwashes. We often don't think of the importance of vent fans in removing fumes, and this is a great example of something that we're not having these conversations in step 1 or 2 or even 3, but we should start having these conversations. So a vent fan in an equipment room. With the capital invested into your splash pad equipment, again, this could be upwards of $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. It's vital to prevent acid and chlorine fumes from damaging that equipment. If anybody on this presentation has ever been in a pump room that doesn't have proper ventilation, you know how ugly that can look and how fast that can happen. And it is fast. We're talking a matter of days before things corrode, and then all of that money that you invested you've got a lot of problems on your hands. Let's put it that way. So placing the chemicals in a separate area, in a separate space, that would be ideal in lessening the impact of chemical fumes having an impact on your equipment. It'll also keep your operator safe as well. So eliminating downtime. There are numerous components required for operation. Again, we're talking chemical probes, pumps, UV bulbs, flow switches, chemicals. A chemical imbalance will prevent the system from spraying water. This is in order to keep the user safe. This makes chemical probes one of a handful of parts that have to be working properly to eliminate downtime. Most controllers will read when the water is properly balanced and then restart automatically. Okay, so they will shut themselves down automatically, but they also have the ability to restart automatically. So you don't have to rush to the splash pad in an emergency type of fashion and start playing around with things. If your system does go into chemical alarm, usually it's about 10-15 minutes before it catches up with itself, and that water is then safe to start spraying again. If a pump fails, water cannot be pumped to the splash pad. Again, another pretty obvious statement, but luckily most pumps show signs of wear and tear before completely failing, which should provide time to source a replacement. If UV is required, again, it is in Pennsylvania, your system will be designed to stop spraying water as well. The dose typically drops to water clarity or bulb life. Similar to a pump, the dose will gradually be reduced as the system ages, giving ample warning to allow for the purchase of a new replacement bulb. If a flow switch fails, the system will turn off the pumps to protect the equipment. We don't want our pumps running without a flow switch. This has the possibility of compounding a problem and destroying your pumps as well. So smaller items like flow switches or spare chemicals are inexpensive and should be kept on hand to avoid downtime. I totally recommend ordering extras, before especially if you're in year one, you haven't had your ribbon cutting ceremony yet. Have as much of these little parts and pieces that are inexpensive on hand, so you're not having to wait for those to be delivered. Okay, section 3 of our presentation, designing a splash pad with safety and maintenance in mind. So this is really the steak and potatoes of the presentation here, guys. Again, the goal is not to remove maintenance, as that will always be a requirement, but rather how to minimize its impact through design. So minimize maintenance through design decisions. Again, what water management system are we going to be using? Our feature selection, surfacing, are we going to use concrete? Are we going to use rubber surfacing? How is that going to be sloped? To our drain locations, surrounding landscaping, and then just your surroundings in general, as far as your site, your community even. So when designing a splash pad that is using a water quality management system, it's important to consider the following: electrical and water supply. Your system, whether it be a flow-through solution or a WQMS solution, will be tailored to your current site circumstances. So in the case of a flow-through solution, knowing the size of the water line and location, along with the size of the sanitary sewer line, will be critical. We're not going to design a splash pad that's using 120 gallons per minute if you only have a 2-inch water line on hand. And I'm speaking in terms of a flow-through solution here. On the other end of the spectrum, the WQMS equipment that shows up on site will be tailored to the electric supply. So knowing the phase information, if it's single phase or if it's 3-phase, that's going to be crucial. Very simple, hey, what's the electrical supply you have on hand, but it's very, very crucial. Again, those pumps are either going to be designed to have 3-phase or single phase. If they're designed for 3-phase, we can't go back to single phase, and that'll really slow things down. Water chemistry. So understanding the chemistry of the water to be used is a very important step. Some customers successfully use well water. Again, I know I mentioned this, but it's important to reiterate that some customers do successfully use water or well water to fill the tank, while others use city water. 9 times out of 10, most people use city water. Your more rural areas do tend to err on the side of well water. And again, both are totally acceptable, but being aware of the water's calcium and iron content, knowing how to test for both, and knowing how to remedy an issue with either you can then maximize the WQMS equipment and the splash pad features. So be aware of high mineral, calcium, and iron content in well water. Well water may have other minerals or metals that will build up in various WQMS components and plumbing on the splash pad deck or splash pad features. It's especially if we're using well water on a flow through splash pad, so the well water is running through our splash pad features. That's another circumstance where we're going to have to pay attention to to our splash pad features. Although we're using powder coat stainless steel, well water again can have these high chemical levels, can be very hard, and even though we are using powder coat stainless steel, they can still leave those calcium deposits on the posts. Local health codes and special requirements. You're going to hear this brought up a couple of times as far as your health codes and understanding, and having a good understanding, because while we pride ourselves on knowing the industry and having a good understanding as far as health codes from state to state, it's really, really hard to have, as a company, to have an understanding of everybody's local county codes or local municipal codes. So it's up to you, the customer, to be aware of any codes specific to the project being planned, and then please pass that information along to us. So a great example is in North Carolina, surface skimmers are required for a tank. That's not required. I don't know if it's required anywhere else, to be honest with you. In Ohio, we have to have a mixing manifold in the tank that is no more than 6 inches from the bottom of the tank. Just goofy things like that. So most splash pads will require approval or certification, especially when it's a WQMS system. So especially when we're recycling and treating with chemicals. If it's a flow through solution, there in PA and Ohio, those don't touch the hands of our state health departments. But keeping the health department informed as designs progress and as equipment is selected will allow them to add their valuable input and stamp of approval in a timely manner. Oftentimes, health departments get a bad rap, but in reality, they are there to ensure the safety of the end user. Here's something that doesn't get brought up a lot, but you're in control. Okay, so a major design consideration should be maintenance crews being comfortable with the types of equipment that they're using. And I know that I briefly did some foreshadowing on this in the beginning slides, but for example, if you're used to a Beck System 5 chemical controller, say you have a pool in your community and that's the chemical controller that you're used to using, we can provide that same controller for your splash pad. This extends to all types of different equipment, like chemical dosing, whether it be an erosion feeder or a diaphragm pump, rather than a standard peristaltic pump. All these things can be taken into account as long as we know these things in advance. So our systems are adaptable in that way to allow for the use of equipment they might already know or have spare parts for. You may also operate existing splash pads yourself, and you have a preferred brand or model, or perhaps you're used to using CO2 rather than muriatic acid. If you were to ask me, like, what do we use? We typically use muriatic acid, but there's no reason why we can't use CO2, again, if that's what you're comfortable with. We're going to spend a little time on this presentation, so bear with me here. Again, this is really the meat and potatoes of the presentation, so things can get a little long-winded, but I promise there's some really, really good information in here. Bright colors, key elements in most splash pads. Everybody wants a big, beautiful splash pad, but different palettes require different maintenance so that they remain new for years to come, and that they always look new for years to come. Again, splash pad features are powder coat or polished stainless steel, which are great because they stand the test of time, but these might be impacted more than normal based on mainly your water chemistry, and especially if your water is close to, or excuse me, if your splash pad is close to salt water. One of the more common calls we receive is how to keep features looking like new for as long as possible. Always keep an eye on your chlorine levels. High chlorine levels are often the cause for having to work harder to keep the features looking in tip-top shape. And really that goes for pool features as well. If your pool has high chlorine levels, more than likely the features are going to be impacted because of that. So exposure to water with high calcium or metal content will increase wear and tear on play features, as well as the water management equipment. Calcium is easier to clean on a painted feature than it is on a polished stainless feature. So bear in mind that as well. A white post will hide calcium deposits, while a blue post will make them more evident. Different age groups and designing for different age groups. Now, this is often a conversation I'm having, not with our maintenance folks, but more your parks and recreation officials. But the reason why it's so important for maintenance is that the trend is towards appealing to lots of age groups. So that means there's a variety of play features and a lot of different components that are, in a lot of those different components, you're able to move and rotate and have this cause and effect relationship with. Just as playgrounds are designed for different age groups, splash pads should have a similar thought into designing for age groups for maximum enjoyment. The great thing about splash pads and the great thing about the features that come with splash pads is that you're often in control of the flow and the flow height. So honestly, guys, if you remember one thing from this presentation, and I hope you remember more than one thing, but if you're going to remember one thing from this presentation, it's what I'm about to tell you. We don't need to spray the water to the moon. We do not need to spray the skin off kids. I know it looks cool when the spray heights are are shooting high up in the air, but we're not providing the Bellagio. We want to provide a safe space for kids to play in. And in actuality, if a ground spray is spraying higher than 8 feet, that has the ability to blind a child. So again, please keep that in mind. I can't tell you how many times I go to a splash pad, where I revisit it after a year or two, and I go there and all of the flows are set way too high. A 1-year-old, a 2-year-old does not want to play on a splash pad where the sprays are so intense that they could possibly get hurt, and they're intimidated by the splash pad. So if we're taking a few of those ground spray, and having them at 4 or 5 feet is perfectly fine. But even if we're taking a few of those ground sprays and we're decreasing that flow to a foot or two, you're going to see your toddlers start to gravitate towards those features. And mom and dad, will be more likely to bring their really little ones to the splash pad as well. They can plop them in front of a ground spray. They're able to run their hands through it. It's turning on and off, so it gives that jack-in-the-box effect, where they don't know when it's about to turn on. And then they can get in on the fun as well.
Mike, to kind of jump in, just to ask a question, because I saw some comments coming up in the box there as I was asking about future plans and things, and there was a comment about having, an all-inclusive playground in a sense. And so that brings up a question: where do splash pads fall as far as accessibility standards and certain measurements? Like you were saying, even the height 4 to 5 feet makes a difference. If all of a sudden, for example, someone's in
pad features, that's another circumstance where we're going to have to pay attention to our splash pad features. Although we're using powder coat stainless steel, well water again can have these high chemical levels, can be very hard, and even though we are using powder coat stainless steel, they can still leave those calcium deposits on the posts. Local health codes and special requirements. You're going to hear this brought up a couple of times as far as your health codes and understanding and having a good understanding, because while we pride ourselves on knowing the industry and having a good understanding as far as health codes from state to state, it's really, really hard to have, as a company, to have an understanding of everybody's local county codes or local municipal codes. So it's up to you, the customer, to be aware of any codes specific to the project being planned, and then please pass that information along to us. So a great example is in North Carolina, surface skimmers are required for a tank. That's not required. I don't know if it's required anywhere else, to be honest with you. In Ohio, we have to have a mixing manifold in the tank that is no more than 6 inches from the bottom of the tank. Just goofy things like that. So most Splashpads will require approval or certification, especially when it's a WQMS system. So especially when we're recycling and treating with chemicals. If it's a flow-through solution, there in PA and Ohio, those don't touch the hands of our state health departments. But keeping the health department informed as designs progress and as equipment is selected will allow them to add their valuable input and stamp of approval in a timely manner. Oftentimes, health departments get a bad rap, but in reality, they are there to ensure the safety of the end user. Here's something that doesn't get brought up a lot, but you're in control. Okay, so a major design consideration should be maintenance crews being comfortable with the types of equipment that they're using. And I know that I briefly did some foreshadowing on this in the beginning slides, but for example, if you're used to a Beck System 5 chemical controller, say you have a pool in your community and that's the chemical controller that you're used to using, we can provide that same controller for your splash pad. This extends to all types of different equipment, like chemical dosing, whether it be an erosion feeder or a diaphragm pump, rather than a standard peristaltic pump. All these things can be taken into account as long as we know these things in advance. So our systems are adaptable in that way to allow for the use of equipment they might already know or have spare parts for. You may also operate existing splash pads yourself, and you have a preferred brand or model, or perhaps you're used to using CO2 rather than muriatic acid. If you were to ask me, like, what do we use? We typically use muriatic acid, but there's no reason why you can't use CO2, again, if that's what you're comfortable with. We're going to spend a little time on this presentation, so bear with me here. Again, this is really the meat and potatoes of the presentation, so things can get a little long-winded, but I promise there's some really, really good information in here. Bright colors, key elements in most splash pads. Everybody wants a big, beautiful splash pad, but different palettes require different maintenance so that they remain new for years to come, and that they always look new for years to come. Again, splash pad features are powder coat or polished stainless steel, which are great because they stand the test of time, but these might be impacted more than normal based on mainly your water chemistry, and especially if your water is close to, or excuse me, if your splash pad is close to salt water. One of the more common calls we receive is how to keep features looking like new for as long as possible. Always keep an eye on your chlorine levels. High chlorine levels are often the cause for having to work harder to keep the features looking in tip-top shape. And really that goes for pool features as well. If your pool has high chlorine levels, more than likely the features are going to be impacted because of that. So exposure to water with high calcium or metal content will increase wear and tear on play features, as well as the water management equipment. Calcium is easier to clean on a painted feature than it is on a polished stainless feature. So bear in mind that as well. A white post will hide calcium deposits, while a blue post will make them more evident. Different age groups and designing for different age groups. Now, this is often a conversation I'm having, not with our maintenance folks, but more your parks and recreation officials. But the reason why it's so important for maintenance is that the trend is towards appealing to lots of age groups. So that means there's a variety of play features and a lot of different components that are, in a lot of those different components, you're able to move and rotate and have this cause and effect relationship with. Just as playgrounds are designed for different age groups, splash pads should have a similar thought into designing for age groups for maximum enjoyment. The great thing about splash pads and the great thing about the features that come with splash pads is that you're often in control of the flow and the flow height. So honestly, guys, if you remember one thing from this presentation, and I hope you remember more than one thing, but if you're going to remember one thing from this presentation, it's what I'm about to tell you. We don't need to spray the water to the moon. We do not need to spray the skin off kids. I know it looks cool when the spray heights are are shooting high up in the air, but we're not providing the Bellagio. We want to provide a safe space for kids to play in. And in actuality, if a ground spray is spraying higher than 8 feet, that has the ability to blind a child. So again, please keep that in mind. I can't tell you how many times I go to a splash pad, where I revisit it after a year or two, and I go there and all of the flows are set way too high. A 1-year-old, a 2-year-old does not want to play on a splash pad where the sprays are so intense that they could possibly get hurt, and they're intimidated by the splash pad. So if we're taking a few of those ground spray, and having them at 4 or 5 feet is perfectly fine. But even if we're taking a few of those ground sprays and we're decreasing that flow to a foot or two, you're going to see your toddlers start to gravitate towards those features. And mom and dad, will be more likely to bring their really little ones to the splash pad as well. They can plop them in front of a ground spray. They're able to run their hands through it. It's turning on and off, so it gives that jack-in-the-box effect, where they don't know when it's about to turn on. And then they can get in on the fun as well.
And to kind of jump in, just to ask a question, because I saw some comments coming up in the box there as I was asking about future plans and things, and there was a comment about having, an all-inclusive playground in a sense. And so that brings up a question: where do splash pads fall as far as accessibility standards and certain measurements? Like you were saying, even the height 4 to 5 feet makes a difference. If all of a sudden, for example, someone's in a wheelchair, that's almost eyeball height kind of thing. So do some of those things come into factor yet, or is that down the road?
Absolutely, BK. All these splash pads are designed with ADA qualifications and certifications in mind. At the genesis of a splash pad, why it was invented in the first place was so that everybody can play on a splash pad. It's inclusive to all ages, all abilities, whether you're wheelchair bound or you're able-bodied. You're going to be playing in a similar fashion as everybody else on the splash pad. And so accessibility, like you had mentioned, is also super important as well. We're always looking or advising that ramps are being used rather than stairs, and that just goes, if you think about a mom bringing her 3 kids with a wagon and maybe a cooler. She doesn't want to lug all that stuff up a flight of stairs or down a flight of stairs. Let's make it easy. Let's use a sidewalk, and we'll make accessibility, to our splash pad, easier in that fashion. So, great question. Does that answer? Is it?
Absolutely, and great point too on your design fee. And I would think that slopes would be a lot safer than having steps, especially when you have water and all those other potentially kids running and things like that as well.
You're stealing my thunder, my friend.
Sorry.
No, it's all good. That's actually the next slide. So your timing is optimal. Keeping water on the pad, hopping back into things here, keeping water on the pad is typically the goal due to the desire to not waste water, especially when it comes to a recirculation system. We want to be getting as much water back to the tank as fast as possible so that that makeup water line isn't always having to turn on. Other factors that are not often thought of include sending chlorinated water into grassy or flowery areas, possibly killing that vegetation. Again, the job of chlorine is to kill organic matter. Walkways around splash pad are not always completed with the same rough broom finish as that of the spray zone on the splash pad. If water is spraying onto an adjacent concrete area, slips and falls can occur. So water spraying off the pad can come into contact with other organic material and then flow back into the drain. This can cause issues with chemicals that could cause the system to shut down because it's out of balance. Most splash pads will have seat walls or benches close by. Consideration should be taken to keep these features, especially rotating, features that rotate. We want to keep these features dry. I had a splash pad project that I was a part of 4 years ago. I had these giant seat structures. They're not really seat walls. I really don't know what to call them, but they weigh a ton. You can't move them once they're installed. And they were mistakenly put in the spray area. So like, mom, dad, especially grandma and grandpa that don't have any interest in getting wet, they can't sit there because they're going to get wet. So, bear in mind. Surfacing. Okay, so sloping the walkway. Slopes of surrounding areas should be taken into consideration during the design phase. If the surrounding walkway is located in the splash zone, meaning that it has, the water is going to land in that area, that should be sloped back to the splash pad drains. Some health departments allow for the walkway to be included in the splash pad, but most do not. We, as a company, always design for a 5-foot spray-free zone, a 5-foot wide buffer that'll be the perimeter of your splash pad spray zone. A concrete splash pad must have a rough broom finish to prevent slips and falls. At the end of the day, we'd rather have sore feet than cracked heads. I know that's kind of an aggressive thing to say, but it drives the point home. So regardless of surfacing, this is a splash pad that at times can have hundreds of gallons of water on the concrete. So although slips and falls are going to happen at some point, just like they happen at a pool, just like they happen at a playground, there's a few things that we can try to stop those or prevent those things from happening often. Signage. So saying water shoes must be worn, or no running. Water should flow. Water should flow and not pool. Again, this goes back to design as well. We want to have a 1% to 2% slope on our entire splash pad that goes back to our drains. Areas that are designed to pool, these are rare circumstances, but if areas are designed to pool, they should be designed to drain when the system is not running. Rubber surfacing. This is a hot topic right now as far as just the splash pad world in general. They obviously they can work, and they not only work, but they can make your splash pad look amazing. But please be careful. We want to make sure that our rubber surfacing is impermeable. If it is porous, water sits in there. It can lead to bacteria and algae. It'll eventually pop. Your rubber surfacing will pop, and now we have more issues on than we'd like to deal with. Once it starts to pop, kids start to pick at it. It makes its way into our drain, which gets into our water quality management system. So a huge consideration in planning revolves around the aesthetic of the entire site and surrounding areas. Organic material in close proximity or overhanging trees, as far as the splash pad is concerned, these things can all look great, but grass right up to the edge of the splash pad or trees overhanging the splash pad will create issues with water chemistry and create a health or safety concern. So talking about like mowing the grass, those grass clippings then making their way onto the splash pad, which then make their way into the drain. You know, often overlooked, but again, super important. You know, not only is your system working harder than it should, when your system is working harder than it should, you're going to use more chemicals. This is more money over the course of time. Overhanging trees. You know, we're talking about leaves or cottonwood trees. You know, and you know, this is why it's so important to visit your splash pad in the morning every day with a blower, and making sure the splash pad is clear of any debris. But if we can, we want to be placing our splash pad in an area with no overhanging trees. So a clean splash pad surface reduces maintenance, it reduces chemical use, and keeps kids safer. Rolling hills and green grass can add to the beauty of a park and add so much visually to a splash pad. And Vortex loves to see pictures of our splash pads in areas like this. We just installed a 2020 Pine Township, if you're familiar with Pine Township in Pennsylvania. We installed this beautiful splash pad that is a part of rolling hills and a lot of green grass, and it looks fantastic. But thought needs to be put into design of the surrounding area. Any landscape area surrounding a splash pad should be sloped away from the pad or have drainage plan to prevent rainwater from flowing off of the landscaping and onto the pad, which would then bring mud or other organic debris onto it. Many splash pads incorporate vaults to house equipment, and these vaults are typically located between the splash pad and the surrounding landscaping. Oftentimes they are in the surrounding landscaping, and the vaults can house pumps, controls, and other electronic devices. Planning of these landscape areas should consider the flow of rain and stormwater to avoid water flowing into these vaults. I just had this happen, and I'll make this real short because I know we're already at 45 minutes here. I did just have this happen where the entire site was sloped to the water management system, and a bunch of stormwater got into the chemical tanks, and we had to come up with a plan and create these curbs around the water management system so that didn't happen again. Playgrounds and splash pads are often located next to each other. BK, you kind of touched on this. They're often located next to each other, which makes for a great play space, but we want to keep into account that the surfacing on our playgrounds might be mulch, right? And so if the playground is right next to the splash pad, kids are going to bring mulch onto the splash pad. That's just what they do. And they'll just track it in naturally, from their feet. So keeping that into account, and making sure that there is a wide enough buffer, or we're putting a shower between, and just a little shower to rinse off between that playground and the splash pad can save a lot of headaches in the long run. Section 4 of 5. We talked earlier about chemical balance and water chemistry, and there are trainings that we recommend when it comes to maintenance staff undertake. So here we're going to look at what each of these qualifications are when we're talking about the AFO certification and the CPO certification, and how that ties into our local requirements. First and foremost, I would recommend having somebody that's over 10 years old. No, we recommend that a person maintaining a splash pad have either AFO or CPO certification. I am CPO certified. We also recommend they attend a splash pad provider's training during commissioning. So on a WQMS, if we are providing a water recirculation system, a water quality management system, we will provide you with training. Okay, so those who are going to be taking care of the splash pad on a day in, day out basis, really it should be required that they attend this training, because there's a ton of great knowledge that that's going to be important for them, more than what I'm going to provide in this presentation. Those folks, know it all. So other equipment used for a splash pad is similar to that of an irrigation equipment, with controls, timers, and automated valves. So your AFO certification helps staff better understand the entire pool system. This is really what we recommend for those who are taking care of it on a day-to-day basis is an AFO certification. It takes more of a deep dive into water chemistry and how that relates to pool equipment. So there are AFO courses available that are intended for Splashpad, specifically for Splashpad operators. If this is an option for the operator, this again would be the best to attend. It's administered by the National Recreation and Parks Association, and the most comprehensive and up-to-date training for pool operators includes information, again, on water chemistry, disinfection, mechanical systems, operations, healthy pools, safety. It really covers the whole gambit. A CPO certification certainly isn't bad. It's better than nothing at all. But this is, more intended for somebody who is going to periodically be taking care of the splash pad rather than somebody who's going to be taking care of the splash pad every single day. It's administered by the Pool and Hot Tub Alliance. That's who I got my CPO certification from. And they're the world leaders in education and certification when it comes to pools and splash pads and taking care of those areas properly. So whether or not any certification is required by a local health code, both certifications are valuable, and there's no reason a person cannot have both. They cannot be both AFO and CPO certified. Speaking from experience, the CPO certification was one of the easiest things I've ever done. It took me about probably 15 total hours of time to be CPO certified. So it's not time consuming, and it's worth it as far as the knowledge you get from it. Bring everything full circle. It cannot be understated enough how important it is to communicate that there will be daily maintenance required, especially for a WQMS system, in addition to the longer maintenance sessions over the operating season. Having these discussions early on will prevent the issues that often come up on site where the maintenance team and operator were not aware of the maintenance involved in keeping the splash pad operational. How much time is this going to take is the most common question we get, period, when it comes to maintenance. How often am I going to, how much time do I need to spend on the splash pad per day? And this is also site driven as well. And you're going to hear as necessary quite a bit in these next few slides. So while daily maintenance is recommended, in some cases it is possible from daily to delve into every 2 or 3 days, especially on flow through splash pads. The maintenance provider will learn the system better than anyone and be able to make that call. But in normal circumstances, each day about 30 minutes of maintenance is necessary. So with the use of a blower, a system with one drain can typically have all daily maintenance procedures completed again in about a half an hour. This includes cleaning the play surface, cleaning the deck drains, checking your pH, chlorine, alkalinity, and calcium hardness. Again, chemicals should be tested and logged. You're going to want to keep a log. I know it's a little bit of a pain, but please keep a log of day in, day out where your chemical levels are at, chemical readings are at. Checking that UV dosage again, just to make sure that you don't, your UV isn't about to fail. You don't need a new bulb. And backwash sand filters if necessary. When the pressure, this is important here, when the pressure in the sand filter has increased 7 to 10 PSI above the starting pressure, the sand filter nut needs to be backwashed. Okay, again, it's site driven. The more people you have, the dirtier they are, the more backwashes you're going to be doing. Bi-weekly. So in addition to the 30 minutes each day, an additional 45 minutes of time spent on the site will be necessary each week. This is going to be your cleaning of your probes. Check your chemical storage tanks to make sure that your chemical levels in those tanks are sufficient. Check underneath your deck drains and your drain baskets and your debris traps, just to make sure that those are on the up and up and there isn't any blockage. And then vacuum out any debris if there is blockage in those spots. Long-term maintenance. So your monthly, semi-annually, and annually. Duration of monthly maintenance is based heavily on the number of valves on site. Your typical splash pad will have 10 or 15. So inspecting play products, solenoid valves, making sure that those are working well is super important. Again, those solenoid valves, those are really what's sending water through your supply lines onto the splash pad. Inspect and clean flow meters, again, if necessary. Inspect ball valves and unions for leaks, if necessary. Clean chemical injectors, clean any dirty nozzles, both in-ground and on elevated features. Especially when it comes to like water cannons, and especially in year one, construction debris is going to get in your supply lines. It's unavoidable. It's going to happen, and a sign of that is that your splash pad features are leaking after the splash pad has been turned off. That means you probably just need to clean out the diaphragm of your solenoid valve, and once that diaphragm is cleaned out, you'll be good to go. But some of that debris also might make its way into the nozzles as well, and it'll clog those holes. We provide the tools to easily remove those nozzles, clean that nozzle out, and everything's all threaded, so it's really easy to screw back on. Semi-annually, diluted CLR. I hope we all know what CLR is: calcium, lime, rust. And non-scratching Brillo pads can be used to remove any stubborn calcium deposits. Annually, checking those play products for wear and damage. Check the quantity of sand in your sand filters. Inspecting all piping. Inspect pump filter lid O-rings. Again, inspecting your chemical probes. Replace solenoid on a bypass line. Very, very important stuff there. And then again, greasing your moving parts, drain and clean chemical storage tanks. Another good slide here to take a screenshot of, folks. Know your local requirement. I don't mean to sound like a broken record here, but in one county and state, you might be required to sample the water once a day. In another, you might be required to sample it twice a day. Some places require that chemical test logs are kept on site, while others do not require that log to be kept at all. Minimum chlorine levels are different from site to site, and some health departments have maximum chlorine levels that they can't exceed. More and more codes are calling for UV, so please be aware of that as well. Again, charting and logging your water tests and maintenance performed each day is a valuable tool, especially when it comes to when we're talking about, hey, this gentleman is getting ready to retire. Somebody needs to take his place. Having these logs to refer to for that new person that is going to be filling those shoes is super important. Experience matters. As a splash pad ages, the operator's experience will grow, and that will help facilitate troubleshooting. Videos can save the day. So when our technicians do arrive on site to do the training, take a video. We don't care. Record these guys. It'll really help you in the long run. Video, have somebody record yourself. That way you remember what you did the last time, if a problem does occur. And we also offer maintenance contracts for those communities that are looking for something like that, an annual refresher training, a semi-annual startup and shutdown. Those are all offered as well, and not a bad idea to consider. Last but certainly not least, if all else fails, having an anchor system that allows you to replace a splash pad feature without having to tear up concrete is going to be crucial to the lifespan of your splash pad and keeping things looking fresh over the course of time. Usually this is around the 12 to 15 year time frame, where your splash pad features might be working fine, but the fact of the matter is that there's been a lot of really cool splash pad features that have been released over those 12 to 15 years. And others, other splash pads in surrounding communities that might be newer. People are gravitating towards those rather than your splash pad that is 12 to 15 years old. If you have an anchor system in place that allows you to easily remove and replace with a new feature, it will solve that problem. That's it, guys. I landed just under an hour. I hope I kept your interest. I'll let BK open up the floor for any questions. Again, I know that we have our service technician, Jacob, on hand as well. He's been nice enough to join us. He comes with over 15 years experience serving splash pads throughout the world. So he's a wealth of knowledge. If I can't answer it, I'm going to have Jacob chime in and answer those questions for me.
And there has been some discussion and comments looking into accessible design and things. And it looks like there are several folks here that are in the long-term planning of getting into a splash pad, so I saw some within the next year or two, some are looking more 5 to 8 years down the road. And so with that kind of in mind, can you recommend an ideal stakeholder team for planning? Obviously you're going to have your directors and the folks that are, on the money side and kind of those decision factors, but can you recommend some other folks that maybe get forgotten, or folks that should be at the planning table that necessarily aren't always there?
Yeah, you're a park and maintenance supervisor. Hardly ever involved in those conversations, but again, designing with maintenance in mind, super important that they're there. They're going to be the ones that are that are on hand with this every single day. A master planner, getting a site survey done is as soon as possible. Topographic site survey done. That way, that's really going to be our blueprint, our roadmap for planning. It never hurts to bring in a landscape architect as well. That's a little bit further along. But a landscape architect, we work with landscape architects all the time. They're always super helpful when it comes to just facilitating the planning of things. Usually splash pads are a part of a bigger scope, right? They're often a piece of a larger puzzle. You're bringing in a landscape architect in those discovery stages and those planning stages certainly helps as well. Or an aquatic designer, aquatic design firm. And we have a list of recommendations when it comes to those folks, who we have worked with in the past and have a great relationship with.
It was a great question that just came in here. Is in your opinion, if you're converting a city pool area, for example, to splash pads, would you say easier, or are there more benefits to starting from scratch versus a retrofit or a remodel?
And Jacob, I hope you're on the call, because I want you to weigh in here, but I've seen more success when just starting from scratch, demoing it, tearing it up, backfilling it with dirt, compacting it, and we have a clean canvas to work from, rather than filling in the pool with concrete, because if those walls are still there, they're going to move, right? Those pool walls are going to move gradually over time, and once those pool walls start moving, your concrete pad is going to crack. Does that make sense?
Mike, I am here, and I would definitely agree with that. And one other point I'd make is, I think a lot of people would be tempted to say, well, could I reuse some of the equipment? And the reality there is, if you're replacing a pool, it's probably of an age where you wouldn't want to reuse the equipment.
Very good points. Thank you. Now, on the surfacing side, I did have a question. Just wondering, what about permeable surfacing? You know, we see more of this porous pavers and things like that being used. Is that something either in the surrounding areas that kind of help with some of that water control and keeping things where it belong, or is that something that creates more of a hazard because of other problems that maybe we don't think about?
Go ahead, Jacob. I haven't had any splash pads that use those permeable pavers before. I am actually about to have one in Carbondale, YMCA. We're going to be doing a splash pad out that way, but that's not installed yet, so I don't have that hands-on experience.
Yeah, I've seen it a little bit in the field. I've seen permeable pavers more often used off to the side, as you mentioned. I think, you know, the whole idea of this presentation is that if things are thought out and planned in advance, they're going to be a lot more successful. So, you know, I don't want to be too technical, but the idea when he was speaking about impermeable rubber is that typically with a permeable surfacing, are we thinking, okay, where's that water going to go? Is it planned that our drainage is now lowered, right? Because if I put pavers there that are, let's say, 2.5 inches tall, and my drain is it level with the tops of those pavers, well, now I have that standing water issue that Mike referenced earlier.
Good points. Well, without seeing any huge burning questions popping into the chat box there, we're going to respect everyone's time, but I want to really thank Mike and Jacob for jumping in there. It was very helpful to gain a larger perspective, especially for folks that are more on the consideration side of things, but also some important, you know, good notes to think about time-wise of if we do have splash pads, you know, are we using that kind of frequency, especially on greasing and things like that, or has it been a set it and forget it, and maybe we should be thinking about a lot of these things more carefully. So, Mike, we said this is going to be a series. So, what's our next topic that we're going to be hearing from you?
Yeah, so we already, that's a great question. So we already did touch on it a bit, but it's going to be we're really going to delve into water quality management systems and knowing anything there is to know about a water quality management system and what you're getting into if you do decide to use those solutions.
Mike. And I would like to thank everyone for joining us today for another shop talk. And this is a great start to a wonderful partnership with our friends from Vortex Aquatic Structures. So thank you again for joining us, and I hope to host you again in the near future. Bye, everyone.
See you, BK. Thanks again.